Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm a little late. We are starting the publicity for the book, which will be out on September 26th. And so I've done podcasts all day, which is kind of fun because I haven't really, weirdly, not very many people have read this book. And of course, the podcasters all have. So it's kind of fun to get real time feedback on it. All right. So, but you also know a couple of things, and one of them is that I can't stand things where they take forever to get down to work. Although I did have a meeting this morning where we said hello, and then I'm like, okay, let's get down to work. And they're like, normally there's a little chit chat. I'm like, oh, okay. But let's get right down to it today because you had a lot of questions. Oh, the Erie Canal. I would love to kayak the Erie Canal. It's one of my bucket list ideas. Anyway, let me suggest that you've asked a whole lot of questions today, and I'm going to try and put them in a number of different frameworks. And in the process of doing that, I'm going to terrify you. And don't turn off the video then, because I think it's really important to understand where we are, but I am not terrified. I think it's important to know where we are and how that fits into a larger picture. So if you hear me going down what you consider a really terrifying rabbit hole, stay till I get out, okay? Because I'm going to come out again today. All right, so I want to start with, a lot of you are asking questions about polls, especially the poll from the Wall Street Journal / I forget the name of it. I'm sorry, I have been doing this all day, so I'm going to be even vaguer than usual on this. That said that Biden voters and Trump voters are evenly tied going into the 2024 election as of right now. And there's a couple of things I want to say about that, a number of things I want to say about that. First of all, it is too early to give this any thought at all. I mean, especially in the summer, people are not paying attention, and honest to God, we're 14 months out. And I was looking the other day in the 19th century, because I was actually reading some platforms from the 19th century. A fairly early convention, when people still didn't know who was going to be president in the 19th century, was in June of the year that the campaign was going to happen. So this early on, people were still focusing on Congress and on state houses and all that. They are not thinking about the presidency, and I don't think that's unhealthy. I feel like we're constantly running for president around here. And anyway, all that to say, it is too freaking early to take any polls seriously. But the other thing you need to know is that polling is in a really funny place right now, because each pollster has different techniques, and when polling first rose in the middle of the 20th century, people thought it was the answer. I mean, you just had to read the polls, then you would know exactly what was going to happen. And then Gallup poll came out in one of I forget which one it was now. I think it was 1948, but I could be wrong on that, and said, oh, well, this is really clear. This is how it's going to happen. They were dead wrong. And so everyone was like, oh, crap, maybe polls aren't that accurate. So what we're looking at now is a number of different pollsters coming up with all kinds of different ways to look at things. And they all have models. And some of the models are really good, and some of the models are not good. And this is why you've seen the rise of people aggregating the polls and saying, well, this is a far left outlier, this is a far right outlier, we'll take all the rest, and then in a sense, we'll poll the polls. All that is interesting, but it's much harder, I think, now to have faith in the polls, not because I'm trying to dump on pollsters, but because there's so many moving pieces right now. If you are interested in following polls, there is one person that I follow everything he does. I don't know how to pronounce his name, unfortunately, but it's Tom, Bonier. Bonnier, I have no idea. But he's a really interesting pollster because he compares the polls that people are delivering with voting registrations and the patterns in particular districts. So in 2022, he was the only pollster who was even vaguely right. And if you remember, we were all like, there's going to be this red wave, it's going to be, everyone's going to vote Republican. And he kept sitting there saying, I don't think that's right. But he wasn't like, you're all wrong. It's like, I don't think that's right. And I remember reading one of the he was actually looking at a specific poll that was looking at a specific state, and he was like, there is no way to get this outcome correctly. As in, there have been this many new registrations in this area since the Dobbs decision. They're overwhelmingly young women. And in order for to come up with the idea that the Republicans are going to win this district to what this poll says, like 80% of those women, young women, would have to vote Republican. And he's like, that's just not happening. So I find him very useful to follow. If you're gonna worry about the polls, follow him, because he's almost like a scholar of the polls. And I just think he's really smart and really interesting. I'm not bothering to look yet myself, because I think there's a lot of other jockeying going on that is of more interest to me and with my specialty. But before you freak out about the polls, be aware at least him and other people, I'm sure, are actually studying the polls, not polling people. They're studying what the polls say and comparing them to a larger political view that I just found really very helpful. Now, the third thing, though, to think about polls, and the reason that it's hard to stomach polls right now, and that does in fact reflect on that thank you, that's him. Somebody just put it up. I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry. I do everything written, so I don't know how to say anything. The other reason to think about polls is because of something that is crucially important going into 2024. And that is, I don't think we're as aware in this moment as we need to be, that in a democracy, what matters almost more than anything else is popular opinion. And the way you shape popular opinion is in part by giving people a story that they want to believe in, and in part by making them feel as if they are part of a crowd. So you are much more likely, and political scientists will tell you this, you are much more likely to adopt a position, if it's pretty common, than you are to say, yeah, I'm going to be the only person who believes, that horses can fly or whatever. So one of the things that we've really seen the rise of lately, and I'm not going to put a start date on it, but I'm going to tell you more about it in a bit, is the use of polls to convince people that something is happening when it's not. So in 2022, for example, a lot of the polls that you saw predicting this red wave were actually put into the public sphere by Republican candidates and Republican candidacies. And we've seen this recently with some DeSantis polls, where it is quite literally they're coming from the DeSantis people trying to say, hey, look at our internal polls. These show you how well we're doing. And the thing is that campaigns do have their own polls, but those are not at all necessarily the ones that they're showing the public, because they're trying to get the idea out there that something is far more powerful than it really is. One of the reasons that you look for unaffiliated polls, and if you notice, I tend to do unaffiliated, name unaffiliated polls when I look at support for gun safety legislation, for example, or support for reproductive rights, all of those things, is because unless you know who the pollsters are, you might be being played. But the reason that you're being played is crucially important. It's because political futures depend on what people think is happening, not necessarily what is happening. So when you look at polls, and this is going to be the whole theme I'm going to be talking about today, is the importance of articulating a vision that is really what is happening, as opposed to what people think is happening. And this is actually dead in my wheelhouse, in the sense that I began to study politics the way I study politics because I watched the rise of Reagan, and I was working as a waitress at the time in Oklahoma, and the people who I was working with were all evangelical Christians, and they were just totally thought the sun rose and set over Ronald Reagan, even as he was taking away the things they needed to survive. And they thought about the Democrats who were trying to help people like them, who were in the service industry and were quite poor. At the time, waitresses' minimum was $2.01 an hour. They thought they were just the worst things ever. And I found that just fascinating, that people were making life decisions based on what they were being told in their churches or whatever, rather than what was really happening. And that's actually how I started studying this relationship between what people think is happening and what is really happening, because it's that interplay that determines whether or not we have a successful democracy or not. So a couple of more things. I'm gonna come back to that and back to polls, but as usual, I want to give you maybe I'll actually go right into this now. The reason that this matters, first of all, is because the way we talk about things and the things we believe really matters. But we are in a moment in the United States right now where a minority, and I mean political minority, a small group of people is trying to take over our democracy by hitting specific places to convince everybody that they're the majority. They are not. When we look, for example, at support for gun safety legislation, the people who want gun safety legislation, it's like 86%. It's some incredibly high number of people. Similarly, reproductive rights. Similarly, taxes on the wealthy and on corporations. All the things that the Biden administration and the Democratic Congress are putting into effect are extraordinarily popular. And this is actually a really interesting thing that from the beginning, this fascinated me about the Biden administration, because other presidents like Donald Trump or George W. Bush had used executive orders to put forward unpopular things to sort of, override the popular will. But because of the fact that the Republicans had sewn up the Senate and the Supreme Court and places like that through the different methods that they've used, like filibustering, the first thing Biden started to do when he put in executive orders was to make popular things happen. And that changed the entire dynamic. It's very hard to say, you shouldn't be doing an executive order that actually 80% of people really like. So what's interesting about the moment we're in is that the things that the Biden administration is putting in place are hugely popular. Virtually across the board, they are hugely popular. But that's not what people believe is happening. And that's partly because of the way that the radical right has managed to co-opt the public narrative. So what are they trying to do? Because they can't command a majority, and I say this to you all the time, that that the radical right is on the ropes because they're being so in your face. If they had the votes, they could just sit back and let the system roll on. It's when you are trying to take a system over because you don't have the popular support that you pull the kind of stuff that they're pulling. The attempts, for example, in Alabama and Florida and Ohio to keep illegal district maps in place, even though their state courts have said these are illegal, you cannot have them. They're just doing it anyway because they know if it's a free and fair vote, they're not going to be able to win. And you see this really dramatically right now in Wisconsin, where Democrats win the state house and they win the Senate, which are both statewide races, handily all the time. But the Republicans have a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives. That's because of gerrymandering. And that's why when the Wisconsin voters elected Janet Protasiewicz in April of last year, she was going to be on the Supreme Court that was going to review those maps and say, this is not fair. If you have a majority of people voting for Democrats, they ought to have a majority in the House of Representatives instead of letting your opponents have a 2/3 majority. And this is why there is now a move afoot in Wisconsin to try to impeach Janet Protasiewicz, to say that we have, and they keep saying the Democrats are trying to steal the state. Well, the opposite is true. In fact, the state has been stolen with these unfair maps, and the state Supreme Court under Protasiewicz is trying to make them fair again. So anyway, I always emphasize that if the radical right felt comfortable, they would not be pulling the kind of crap they're pulling. So what are they trying to do? We're in a different moment in the United States than we've been in before, because it's really not a question of one flavor of democracy or another. The radical right has thrown out the idea of democracy and is looking to replace it with something that was modeled in Hungary by Viktor Orban. You remember Tucker Carlson kept running to Hungary, and now the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, has met a number of times in Hungary, and Viktor Orban has come to speak at CPAC, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has actually used Hungarian laws as a blueprint for the stuff he's putting in place in Florida. They are trying to put in place something they call illiberal democracy. And what that argues is that democracy is obsolete. And democracy is obsolete because it insists on everybody being equal before the law. If you insist on everybody being equal before the law, that means that men, white, straight men, are no better, no worse, but also no better than women, LGBTQ individuals, minorities, people that by admitting their equality will upset a traditional patriarchal society. And that traditional patriarchal society, of course, is in the United States and in other countries, some other countries as well, deeply married to Christianity. So the idea is to get rid of democracy, which they consider is tearing apart the fabric of society because of secular values, because it lets women be equal to men, and it agrees to the rights of LGBTQ individuals and racial and ethnic minorities. They want to get rid of that and go back to this idea that some people are better than others. And one of the reasons that people like me identify that not only as an undermining of democracy, but also as the first giant step toward fascism, is once you have accepted, and by the way, this is Abraham Lincoln who taught me this, once you've accepted that some people are better than others, it's only a question of time until you have made categories that decide which kind of person you are. And at the end of the day, there's one person, logically, who's better than everybody else. And this is exactly what Abraham Lincoln said. He says, once you start tearing apart the Declaration of Independence, where's it going to stop? And this is, of course, the roots of the concepts of fascism as Benito Mussolini set them up in the 1920s. A very interesting story there. But, all right. So they're trying to get rid of democracy and replace it with this idea of illiberal democracy, or what we call it in the United States, Christian nationalism. And one of the things that says is that we don't want immigrants because immigrants pollute the what they consider the purity of the country, which I just have a very hard time wrapping my head around, since, of course, the United States is a country made of immigrants. So I don't know, well, whatever, I'm not going to go down that. But they're trying to get rid of immigration, and this is the whole focus on build the wall and kill people who are trying to come over and all that. They're trying to get rid of women's rights, and we can see that, of course, with the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision. But one of the other things that you have asked about is schools. The attacks on public schools right now, everything from the libraries that have books that certain people, and remember, there are very few people who are actually challenging the books in the schools, but they are powerful because they fill out the paperwork, and the laws are written in such a way that as soon as somebody challenges a book, that's it. It has to be reconsidered, and a lot of people are actually just simply pulling books off the shelves, or making it that every book has to be looked at, and therefore you can't see any of the books. The students can't see any of the books. It's not just that, though. The attacks on public schools as places where children are endangered because of secular values is very much a part of this political project, and the whole movement lately to put school vouchers in place is deliberately that, a way to move the money that our taxes put into public schools into private schools, overwhelmingly Christian schools. And there was a recent Supreme Court case about this. So our tax dollars, which are not supposed to be used for religious, separation of church and state, for religious things, are being used to support Christian schools, to get people out of the secular schools and to get them into Christian schools. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. that a lot of wonderful people are talking about on all the social media channels, about how that excludes well, basically private schools can take anybody they want, so that excludes differently abled kids, it excludes black kids, it excludes, you can make a whole list of this. But for my purposes today, one of the things this does is it breaks down the teaching of democracy as one in which everybody should be equal before the law. That is no small thing, because the point of public schools is, of course, to educate people so they have a decent education and can function in the world. It is also to illustrate the principle that everybody is equal, that rich kids shouldn't get schooling that poor kids don't. And that is exactly the direction we're going. That the money will come out, the public money will come out of the public schools and go to private schools, where kids who go to those private schools are going to get educations, although a certain kind of education that isn't a Christian education that feeds right into this idea of illiberal democracy or Christian nationalism. And the kids who don't have access to that will simply not get a good education, because the money has been taken out of the public schools. And I just have to say, I do a lot of work at the public schools, and just a big shout out here to public school teachers who do just yeoman's work every freaking day. And you probably all know that we all love our own public schools, but there is this narrative that the public schools are bad. And that's a narrative, by the way, that comes straight from the Reagan years, that somehow public schools were not terribly good. So you asked about those things. That's what's on the table right now. And that is where I'm going from here to some more of the questions that you asked. Hold on. So if that's what you want, not you personally, but if that is what a Christian nationalist wants, how are you going to get it in a country where the majority of people, and I would venture to say the vast majority of people, disagree with you? It's a democracy, so what are you going to do? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to take over key nodes of society, so you can exercise power even if you don't really have it. So let's think about where those might be. Oh, I know, the Supreme Court. I mean, that's a pretty obvious one. But for our purposes today, what that means is that political minority that wants to take over the country is really working to manipulate the system so it has power even though it doesn't have the numbers. Yes, it's anti-democratic, but that's the whole point. They're not interested in advancing democracy. They're interested in staying in power to put their vision of Christian Christian nationalism in place. So let's start here with, you asked about, with Tommy Tuberville. I talk about him a lot, and people say, is it possible that he's really not upset about abortion, that he's really holding the more than 300 places open in the American military that are open right now because he wants to replace them with Trump appointees? Well, I don't know what Tommy Tuberville is thinking. You'll be shocked to hear, not least because, I'm so sorry, it's been a very long day, I'm going to say this. He's dumb as a box of rocks. But tell me why I shouldn't think that's what he's doing. Let's look at the evidence here. I mean, and I don't know. He might not be. My point here is going to be that absolutely we should think that this is what he's doing. Now, at the end of the day, he might not be, and then we're fine. But if you think about it, the holding open of a place to fill it with a Trump appointee has a precedent. That was Mitch McConnell and the Supreme Court seat that eventually went to Neil Gorsuch. Remember that he wouldn't let Barack Obama fill a Supreme Court seat because he said it was too close to an election, even though it was March when Obama nominated Merrick Garland to that seat, and every other president had been able to do that, unless it was a lame duck session, which is after a president had been voted out of office. In that period of time, which was months away at the time, on occasion, presidents would hold things over because they would say, somebody else is already in this office, I shouldn't be the one to fill that place. He completely broke precedent, and he insisted that what he was doing was legitimate. It was not. So, and then of course he put Amy Coney Barrett on the court in October, late October of 2020, when balloting was already underway. So clearly the idea of stuffing these positions is absolutely in the Republican playbook. But what about military figures? Think about it. On June 1st, 2020, when Trump walked across Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. with the Bible, remember, and he had Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with him, and basically said, we're going to use the military to crack down on American civilians. Remember when there was the photograph, that extraordinary photograph of the law enforcement officers in full military garb on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which, by the way, now the right wing is showing up as if it's Biden's term that happened. That was absolutely June 2020 of Trump's term, and their names were covered up, if you remember. When that happened, immediately thereafter, the military across the board went public and said, we will support the Constitution. We do not support a single man. We support the Constitution. And they made it very clear, the established branches of the military, and that's different than the people who were on the Lincoln Memorial, who came from the executive branch, because the executive branch does have law enforcement officers in places like the ATF and other places as well, Homeland Security especially. They said, we won't do this. We're not going to get behind Trump. So when that happened, you may not have paid attention to this, but I did, because I'm not even sure I ever wrote about it, but it jumped out at me. The radical right, especially at the time, Tucker Carlson, went after Mark Milley like nobody's business. Remember, they used to call him Thoroughly Modern Milley, which was a reference to a movie about a girl, and kept talking about the woke military and how we needed real men in the military, and on and on and on about the military. Tommy Tuberville is also, of course, on the ground floor of the MAGA movement. Now, I put all those things together and I say, listen, regardless of why he's doing it, he is weakening the American military, which gives an opening to our enemies, and which itself is, I'm not going to use the word treasonous because that actually has legal meaning, but it is frankly appalling that he would do that at all, over abortion, over anything else. But I don't think you can look at the history of the MAGA Republicans and Donald Trump and Tommy Tuberville and believe him at his word that this is about abortion. I just don't think you can. Now, I could be wrong, and this could be about something else altogether. Okay, but people are like, oh, he wouldn't do that. And I'm like, convince me that he would not, because all you've got to say he wouldn't do that is precedent and the fact it is appalling. It does not seem to me that this current group of Republicans cares a lot about precedent and things that would be appalling. We do, on the other hand, though, have these 4 reasons to think that absolutely he would do that. So I would say, yes, it matters that Tuberville is holding out these positions from being filled. And am I willing to say it's about whatever he says? No, I don't trust any of them at this point, because we have a long track record that says we shouldn't trust them. So I feel kind of strongly about that one, because I have a lot of friends in the military, and they put their lives on the line for us every freaking day. And to have this guy, who, by the way, doesn't even live in Alabama, he lives in Florida, pulling this so smugly, basically says they don't matter, and that just really infuriates me. All right, so that was Poles and Tuberville. So you've asked a lot about, no, I'm going to go to that later. You've also asked about Trump and the 2025 project. And people are saying, oh my God, I'm reading this and this is really terrifying. And shouldn't we be talking about this? Yes, what you're seeing in the 2025 project is what it would take to put that Christian nationalism in place. And their vehicle is Trump or someone like him. And that's key right there, because this is not any longer just about Donald Trump. It is about the Republican Party and its descent into a Christian nationalist, anti-democracy party. So what the 2025 project does is it sets out the ways in which this political minority want to take over the government and get rid of the civil servants who stabilize the country. That is one of the reasons bureaucracies are enormously important for stability in a country, is because they're not loyal to one person or another. They're there just to make sure that the passports keep going out and the paperwork keeps going out and the roads get paved. And, they don't care who's in charge. They might vote for one person or another, but they care about doing their job and getting their paycheck. Political theorists will tell you it's enormously important, because if you don't have that buffer layer, that stability layer, people become loyal to one person or another. And that means that in order to stay in power, they're throwing all their resources and all their money behind a certain group of voters, or a party at that point, because you're not going to let the other side vote. And pretty soon you have countries where there's just one coup after another as one side or another takes power. So they want to get rid of the nonpartisan civil servants who run our government and do it very well, by the way. A little bit of a rabbit hole here. I actually am very fond of working with lower level people in government, and they're great. The civil servants are really good. They're really smart. They really know their stuff. They're some of the smartest people I've ever met. And this image that somehow they're all just sitting there grabbing a paycheck and stupid and not putting in any hours is just wrong. They're some of the smartest people I've ever met. So they want to get rid of that. And they also are threatening, and Trump has done this very explicitly, to use the American justice system, which is supposed to be equal for, have everybody treated equally. It never really has, but that to which we aspire, to use it deliberately against political prisoners. So literally, he is saying he wants to be somebody like Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban. And somebody wrote to me the other day and said, Trump, 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 all you talk about is Trump, who cares? And the answer is that I actually am trying very much not to talk about Trump very much, because I care about that narrative, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But because if you don't think it's important that somebody who is the front runner for the Republican Party to become a president wants to use the American justice system against us, then I don't think you should be reading me at all, because that is a crisis that we've never dealt with before, but we know exactly what that looks like. And one of the guys who was in the Trump administration and who wrote as anonymous during it, trying to say, hey, we're the adults in the administration, we're keeping things under wraps, has now quite publicly gone forward and said that Trump was interested in using Guantanamo Bay, the prison at Guantanamo Bay, against his political prisoners. And he was finally deterred from doing that because it wasn't big enough. And the idea of putting him back in office when he is willing to do that is mind-boggling, first of all. So that's what 2020, the Project 2025 is all about, but also worth remembering that it's not just a question of getting rid of Trump. The 2025, which is highly funded by radical right-wing groups who want to get rid of the social safety net, want to get rid of a functioning government, in part because they don't like business regulation and taxes, and in part because of their religious affiliations. They're not necessarily backing Trump. They're willing to back Trump or someone like him. And obviously Ron DeSantis was running really hard for their endorsement. The turning of Florida over into an attempt to make it like Viktor Orban's Hungary was pretty transparent. It doesn't look like he's ever going to get his traction back because he's run such a poor campaign. But just because it wasn't Trump doesn't mean it can't be somebody else. And that is deeply concerning to people like me. All right, now the other thing that I wanted to point out here when I talked about the way things, the things that people believe fit into something else that you've asked about. And one of the things that the Trump administration did and the radical right has done is to embrace a concept known as political technology. The idea that you can create a false reality and that people will vote based on that false reality, and they will vote you into power based on that false reality, and then you can do whatever you want. And while we have talked a lot in the last several years about gaslighting and about the lies and the turning of reality that people on the right have done, there's something I think it's really important to put into that mix now. If you read the theory of political technology as it's known, it was really first articulated in Russia, but of course a number of the people who were working on keeping Vladimir power on the rise to power were actually American political consultants. So I think there's a lot of exchange between the two. One of the ways that you do that is by having this gaslighting. That's a key element. But so is running false candidates. And that's something that I don't think we are focusing on enough. The idea that if you run candidates who basically are lying to you about what they stand for, that is, they might actually be somebody, wolf in sheep's clothing, right? You think you're electing a pro-choice Democrat, and it turns out you're electing a Republican who's going to become a supporter of anti-abortion laws. That, or another obvious person is someone like George Santos from New York. I'm not saying they're necessarily part of this, but they are certainly indicative of the concept of political technology that skews the political system, because people think they're electing, in George Santos's case, a gay Democrat, and instead, a gay Republican, and instead what they're getting is this, right? The serial liar that he turned out to be. But the reason I'm mentioning that now is because one of the things that they point out that's very useful to do if you're going to run false candidates is make sure they have names that can be easily confused with a Democrat. And to me, when we look at the candidacy of Robert Kennedy Jr., and the fact that he is allegedly running as a Democrat, although all of his supporters are Republicans and the money behind him is Republican, it just looks to me a lot like the idea of splitting the Democratic vote by running candidates who seem like they might be representing something that they're not. So in this election so far, we have that Kennedy, a very famous Democratic name, of course, but then we also have the No Labels Party, which claims to be a centrist moderate party, but if you actually look at its funding, it's all radical right money. And that is deeply troubling going forward, not necessarily because third parties are a bad idea, although I'm one of the people who believe that they are. I actually like the idea of many parties, and I actually like the idea of ranked choice voting, which we have here in Maine and has worked very well. But because I remember things like the 1844 election, in which about 4,000 people in New York took the election from Henry Clay and threw it to James K. Polk, and instead of getting rid of enslavement, we got the expansion of enslavement that just this extraordinary expansion of it across the country because of that third party. It was a Liberty Party in 1844. Anyway, it is worth thinking about what's going on right now on the Republican side as being this attempt to create something false, and it's been happening for a while, but something false to convince enough people that that's the direction we're going and that that's what they should support, because they don't have a majority. So if that's the case, Sheila, no wine glass because I'm not in my own house. You'll notice I've got decent reception here. This place that somebody lends me has cable. My house does not have cable. It's a dial-up line, and not a dial-up line. It's a phone line, and there's a sherry glass, but there's not enough water in it. So all right. So if that's the case, where are we? And I've just given you this really terrifying picture of a political minority that is working hard to convince people that they're a majority and that they're taking over the country, and that crucially that they are going to put in place a series of natural or religious laws that will make America great. And this is the whole idea behind having Christian laws in our country, and their argument that the founding fathers were Christians who were deliberately founding this country on Christianity. That is a lie. Okay, that is a lie. They were deliberately separating our government from other governments that were based either in the traditions of monarchy or in religion, because they recognized that those would very quickly lead to despotisms, is what they called them at the time. And so they deliberately founded this country on the idea of the law, and the law separate from religion. That's the truth. And, you know, I could give you gazillions of sources about that, but that doesn't matter. When they keep screaming that this is a Christian nation, they're inventing a past to tell people, well, if we just go back to that past when things were perfect, it's all going to be perfect going forward. I promise you, if this becomes a Christian nationalist country, it's not going to be good for anybody. I mean, there are people who will suffer more direly and quicker than others. But if you look, for example, right now at the kind of authoritarianism you're seeing in Russia right now, do you think a lot of Russians are feeling real good right now about Vladimir Putin? And the answer to that is absolutely not, even if they're not yet on the front lines or bearing the burden of his invasion of Ukraine. They're definitely feeling the bite of sanctions, and you can see this in a number of different ways that I probably don't have time to go into now. All right. So if that's what's happening, why are we, what are some of the signs? First of all, how do we push back against that? But what is some of the signs that those people are very nervous? Well, as I said, one of the things you've seen recently is the application of the law to try and enforce what is in our Constitution, that is equality before the law. So I think it's just today we've had handed down yet again an attack on Alabama's gerrymandered districts, which, like those of Florida and Ohio and other states as well, have given artificial power to Republican candidates that they didn't earn. You know, they're not earning that many votes. Instead, they are simply getting the power of the cheating, basically. So you're seeing a real pushback on the part of Republicans, as I say, to get rid of Janet Protasiewicz in Wisconsin out of fear of fair maps, to insist on unfair maps in Alabama, once again in Florida, to try and keep in place maps that courts have said are unconstitutional. They wouldn't do that if they weren't afraid that a free and fair vote would throw them out of power. So now I'm going to tell you what I'm seeing in the Republican Party. And one of the reasons that many of us are paying as much attention as we are to the trial of Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. It's an impeachment trial, not a judicial trial. He is also under indictment for fraud. But what's happening right now, beginning today in Texas, is an impeachment trial of him. And the reason that this matters is because Paxton has made his career as a MAGA Republican, even before MAGA was a thing. He takes office as a Attorney General in 2015, attacking the Affordable Care Act, really trying to be a thorn in the side of the Obama administration. Then he becomes a full-throated Trumper. And then once Biden is elected, he, of course, tries to get that election thrown out. He files a lawsuit, and he actually speaks at the Ellipse on January 6th before the attack on the U.S. Capitol. And he has made his career as this guy who's really going to push this Christian nationalism. We can call it that in 2016. But that's who he is. He is at the state level in Texas, a real MAGA Republican. And he has made his career as somebody who is an evangelical Christian and stands for those family values that are theoretically at the heart of that worldview. Now, a couple of things here. It is worth remembering that Texas is a Republican-dominated state, but it is a state that got that way with voter suppression. And how do I know that? First of all, because they have a history of voter suppression and dramatic redistricting, but also because if you remember in the 2020 election, Texas is one of those states that was madly scooping up drop boxes so that it would make in Democratic counties so that it would be much harder for Democrats to vote. Once again, you don't do that if you think you're going to win. I promise you the Democrats are more than happy to let anybody they want vote in Massachusetts because they just know that the Democrats are essentially going to win the legislature in Massachusetts, and every once in a while they're going to win the state house, but whatever. They know that they're sitting pretty. They don't have to cheat. Anytime somebody starts cheating, they're nervous, right? So Texas is a Republican-dominated state, but it is a state that if, in fact, things were free and fair, it is not clear that it would be a Democratic state. I mean, a Republican state. It might always be, but it's not nearly as red as people think it is, or they wouldn't have to cheat, right? So the reason the Paxton thing is interesting is because Paxton is positioning himself as somebody like Trump. He's being persecuted by the state, even though he has been impeached by the state house. The state House of Representatives. The Democrats voted for his impeachment, but so did a majority of Republicans. And they impeached him because not actually because of the fraud problem, which happened in 2015, but because a number of four staffers, accused him of abuse of power and of retaliation for their blowing the whistle on him. And he settled for $3.3 million. And then he tried to get the state house to cover that with tax money. And finally, the members of the Republican members were like, okay, enough is enough. But then it gets worse. And this is why this is interesting. Apparently, in 2018, he confessed to an extramarital affair, and he told his staffers that it was over and he and his wife had reconciled, and he was going to repair his marriage and he was going to be a good guy again, right? His wife is in the state Senate. And the trick here is that he didn't, in fact, end the affair. It went underground, and it went underground with the help of a real estate developer who was in real trouble with the law. And that Paxton and this guy arranged, allegedly, for Paxton's mistress to get a job with this fellow. And in exchange for that, Paxton would help him out of his legal trouble. The reason that I'm mentioning this is that apparently, according to the Texas Tribune, which is a phenomenal newspaper, by the way, really crackerjack newspaper, says that that's going to be the focus of the impeachment hearing in the Senate. Why does this matter? It matters because in the Senate, his wife is going to continue to, I feel like I'm so far in the weeds on this. I'm sorry. It does actually matter. I'm going to climb back out in a minute. His wife is going to sit on the trial, but she's not allowed to vote. So the fact that she's going to be in the room, poor woman, and listening to all this, means that they need 21, I think it is, votes off the top of my head to convict him. And I believe it's 9 of those are going to have to come from Republicans. Somebody has just posted the courtroom stuff. I've been working all day. I haven't even looked at the news today. But according to the Texas Tribune, what they're really going to focus on is that affair. Why does that matter? It matters in all sorts of ways, of course, but in terms of what I'm talking about, you know me, I like to stay in my lane. What I'm talking about for politics, the Republicans literally are going to have to choose between this dude who certainly looks to be extraordinarily unsavory in any number of ways, but who literally is on having this public hearing about something that flies directly in the face of that image that he has portrayed of being a good Christian family man. They're either going to have to accept that and say, we don't care. So long as he's going to keep us in power, we're okay with this. Or they're going to have to say, no, we're not. He's gone too far. And this is the exact same split, really, that you've seen in the Republican Party in the nation. And that will say a lot about where the party goes going forward. So this case, which in a way seems like kind of small potatoes, is really illustrative of what the party might do going forward. And it's unsavory as one can imagine, but at least it's very clear, and it will it says a lot about where the country might be going. Now, the place I started here was with popular opinion and how much that matters to a democracy. And I wanted to start with it and also end with it, because the other thing that everybody asks is, what the heck's going on with the fact Biden's not getting any credit for anything, and why is Kevin McCarthy talking about impeaching him? At the national level, the Republican Party has a huge problem. Not only does it have the problem of the fact that its standard bearer has 91 counts against him. 91 counts, they're counts against him in these indictments. Their other problem is the fact that the House is dominated by far-right Republicans who want to put in place that Christian nationalism that the rest of us don't want. And part of that, of course, is gutting the federal government. And the federal government's doing a lot of things that people really like right now. And I mean really like. I was looking at the numbers this weekend, and they're really off the charts. So one of the things that you're seeing right now is this looming shutdown. And you've asked me a lot about the shutdown and what's going to happen with the shutdown. I don't know. One of the things I do know, though, is that every time the Republicans have shut the government down, which they've done a number of times now, the backlash is against them, not the Democrats. People understand that this is a Republican tactic, not a Democratic tactic. And so McCarthy is quite eager not to shut the government down, because he knows they're the ones who are going to pay the price. However, the far-right members of his conference, it's a Democratic caucus and the Republican conference, I have no idea why, the conference are saying, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to shut down the government anyway, because we want, and they have a long list of things, and one of the things they want is to impeach Biden. They have no grounds to impeach Biden, and nobody is making any illusions that they have grounds to impeach Biden, except James Comer of Kentucky, who keeps saying he's got material proving that Biden took a bribe from China. There is literally no evidence of that. I mean, I've been reading it all along. There's literally no evidence of this. And this is one of the reasons I always say to you, always pay attention to what they will say in a court of law, because there's no penalty for lying in front of the cameras. So they have no evidence of that, but what they're trying to do is throw a bone to the far right so that it will agree at least to fund the government in the short term. Why? Because short-term hit to government funding is going to be really bad for the Republicans, because people are going to recognize that they're the reason that so many popular things are shutting down. And the Biden administration is already ramping that up, saying literally, you're cutting the programs that people are demanding that we have because you want to do things like, any number of their really far right demands. I mean, they want extraordinary cuts to the government, far more than McCarthy agreed to when they agreed to raise the debt ceiling. They're really asking for everything they want and taking the government hostage to do that. So that's why they're doing that. But one of the other pieces that I think it's worth paying attention to here is what the current U.S. Congress is doing under the Republicans. And the answer is nothing. They're passing all these performative bills, and they'll never get through the Senate because they're crazy right things. And this has been a Congress that has accomplished virtually nothing. And that's really important, I think, for people to understand, because for all their posturing and all the hearings that are supposed to be turning up this and turning up that and doing this and doing that, they're not doing anything. And that matters to people. The fact that Congress is essentially sitting there collecting a paycheck when they're really not making any effort actually to govern. That's worth having in the news. The reason that I put all these out here is because one of the reasons there are many reasons that Biden doesn't get a lot of coverage, but one of the reasons that he's not getting the traction that he should, and I keep saying this, I was not a Biden supporter. And I am eating every one of those words, because this is a transformative presidency, not only in that he is deliberately using the federal government to try and break up the extraordinary race to the top of all our money in the last 40 years. He's trying to rebalance society so that ordinary Americans actually have much more of our wealth and our income, and that we have many more government services that, like the rest of the world does, or the rest of the developed world does. He's done that extraordinarily effectively and passed laws that under any other administration would truly be groundbreaking. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, you remember Trump talked all the time about we're going to have infrastructure, never passed. Biden got it through, incredibly hard work, but got it through. Got through the Inflation Reduction Act, which has made this enormous investment in climate change, but also is what is permitting the government to negotiate with Big Pharma over the cost of drugs. And again, that was an accomplishment that was unheard of, if you think about it. And he managed to make it happen. And by the way, in terms of being popular, the Republicans want very much to get rid of that. 86% of Americans want the government to be able to negotiate drug prices, as other developed countries do. I believe America is an outlier in that we're the only country, I shouldn't ever say singular like that, but almost only country that doesn't have some kind of government intervention in drug prices, or didn't until the Inflation Reduction Act. 86% of Americans want that to be the case. So Republicans going out there and saying, oh, Americans hate this. No, they don't. 86% of us think that the government should be able to negotiate drug prices that it's going to pay for Medicare and Medicaid recipients with Big Pharma, the way they do in other countries. That was a big deal. The CHIPS and Science Act that has primed the pump, if you will, to bring home so much research and development, and also the construction of chip factories. These are all absolutely huge, huge things. Similarly, in foreign affairs, Biden's work at shoring up international alliances that Trump has said he's going to take us out of is a different vision of an inclusive world that, again, any one of these things would be administration defining events, and there's a whole package of them. It's really, quite frankly, astonishing. And I can see now the degree to which that the government is really now focusing on trying to create a legal structure and a rules structure that give us all a shot in this country, which has been thin on the ground for the last 40 years. If those of you who are here can remember back before that long. I was talking to someone today who was in their mid-30s and they don't remember the 70s. So I said, I remember the first time something happened, and the person was like, oh, I don't, that's kind of history book stuff. So anyway, so why did I start with polls and narratives and end here with Biden's successes? And the answer to that is, I think it's really crucial to continue to remember that the way people think about things, popular opinion, is really the key piece of a democracy. Even in a democracy where things have been gerrymandered, for example, you can see that the Republicans are not talking about abortion any longer. They're trying to back away from that because they know how unpopular that stance is. So people have said, what can I do? What can we do going forward to make sure that Trump is held to account under the 14th Amendment, to make Tommy Tuberville take off his hold, to push back on what else did I have here on the Electoral College, which I didn't talk about now. How do we do that? And I think everybody's sort of looking for, here's the number to call, here's the letter to write, and those things are incredibly important. But the way that we, for the next 14 months, change the ship of state is by talking. And by writing, and by saying to people, hey, I love that we're investing in addressing climate change, or hey, did you see about these rebates? Or I'm furious, and I am furious that Tommy Tuberville has put a hold on our military. That's something that is, to me, just unconscionably off the charts. And saying, this is not okay. And if our representatives hear that enough from enough people, And they will hear it if enough of us talk about those things the same way they're hearing about abortion rights, the same way they're hearing about George Santos, who's in real trouble right now, in part because up and coming Republicans in the state of New York have said they don't want to be associated with him because they're sort of hoping for political careers. The more they hear of that, and the more they hear people taking back the grounds for our democracy, the better the chances are that what Biden is doing gets traction, and what the radical right is trying to do by hoodwinking us into thinking we're a minority doesn't get traction, because they're not a majority. They're a small minority, but they're a small minority that's very vocal, that gets a lot of attention, and that is convincing a lot of really decent human beings to go along with them, or at least not to speak up against them because they're afraid. And that's key to the rise of an authoritarian government, is to convince a majority that they need to shut up because they should be afraid. Do you remember the book Swimmy, where all the little fish keep getting eaten by the big fish until they all get together and they look like a big fish and they scare the big fish away? It's kind of our Swimmy moment, where we gather together and convince that big fish that we're an even bigger fish because there's a lot more of us. And so going forward, I mean, this is, somebody just asked me why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because it's clear they're frightened, by which I mean the radical right is frightened. And it's clear there's an awful lot of people who are just waiting to spring forward and make their majority known. Not to say we're going to agree ever on a lot of stuff, but we do agree on democracy, and that's what this moment's about. All right, I'm gonna let you go, and I'm going to sit down and write. Our Swimmy moment, somebody says. That's great. And I'll see you again, I think, next week. I will talk to you soon. Thank you for being here.